Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, glad to share another quiet inquiry with you. Tell me, do you keep old papers, folded so long the creases have softened with age? Watson learned that even a single seal, pressed upon a fold, can betray a truth others overlooked. Do subscribe so no forgery escapes your notice. Now, settle in. For as Holmes believed, the truth rarely hides in the document itself, but in the small details a hurried eye forgets to question. Chapter 1. The Gentleman from Lincoln's Inn. It was upon a bitter evening in November, when a fog the colour of old parchment had settled so thickly over London that the lamps of Baker Street showed only as pale and swimming halos beyond our windows, that I returned from a visit to a patient in Marylebone to find Sherlock Holmes absorbed in one of his singular pursuits. I had left him that afternoon deep in a chemical treatise. I found him now surrounded by a dozen small candles, each burning beneath a saucer of coloured wax while he timed their melting with the aid of his pocket watch and made notes in a hand grown cramped with concentration. "You will forgive me, Watson," said he without lifting his eyes from the nearest flame, "if I do not rise to greet you properly. I am engaged in a matter of some delicacy. The comparative rates at which sealing wax of various compositions softens and hardens. It is a subject criminally neglected by the writers of criminal jurisprudence, and one which I flatter myself I shall soon remedy. I confess that I regarded this latest enthusiasm with the tolerant amusement of long acquaintance, and settled myself by the fire to warm hands grown stiff with the cold. It was not 5 minutes later that we heard the bell below, followed by the murmur of Mrs. Hudson's voice, and a heavier tread upon the stair, and our landlady presently announced a visitor. "Mr. Edmund Harcourt," said she, and withdrew. The gentleman who entered was perhaps 55, dressed with the sober precision of his profession, his silk hat and gloves betraying the solicitor as plainly as any brass plate upon a door in Lincoln's Inn. He carried himself with the particular anxiety of a man unused to trouble, and his eyes, when they found Holmes still crouched over his experiment, widened with something between astonishment and doubt. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I had hoped to find you at more conventional employment." "My employments are seldom conventional, Mr. Harcourt, and are the more useful for it," Holmes replied, rising at last and waving our visitor to the basket chair. "Pray sit and tell me what has brought a partner of Harcourt and Steele out into such a night as this." Our visitor betrayed no surprise at being named and placed so precisely, though I saw his glance flicker toward the card he had certainly not yet presented. He seated himself, drew off his gloves finger by finger in the manner of a man ordering his thoughts, and began. "I come, Mr. Holmes, on behalf of the estate of the late Sir Matthew Bellamy, of whom you may have heard. He died some 18 months since, leaving his fortune to his son Charles and his daughter Eleanor. That fortune rests very largely upon certain lands lying some miles beyond the northern suburbs, acreage which, until recently, was reckoned worth little more than the rents of a few tenant farmers, and is now worth a great deal more, I collect, or you should scarcely be sitting in that chair," said Holmes. "You collect rightly. The Northern and Coastal Railway Company has resolved to build a new terminus, and the surveys show that a portion of the Bellamy land lies directly athwart the proposed line. They are prepared to pay a sum that would astonish you for the right of purchase." "A common enough tale, thus far. Continue." Harcourt leaned forward, and here his anxiety, which had been merely professional, became something more personal. "The difficulty, Mr. Holmes, lies in the title. Sir Matthew's ownership of that particular tract descends from a land patent issued more than 60 years ago, a document granting the boundary in terms that have never since been questioned, because no one troubled to question land worth so little. Now that its value has multiplied 100-fold, a neighbouring estate has begun to whisper that the boundary was always in dispute, and that without the original patent to prove otherwise, the Bellamy claim might be successfully challenged." "And where?" Holmes inquired, settling into his chair with a particular stillness that told me his interest was now genuinely engaged. "Is this indispensable document kept?" Until a fortnight ago it lay among the family archives at the Bellamy country seat. Given the delicacy of the negotiations, I advised that it be brought to town and kept close at hand, in case the railway company's solicitors wished to examine it. It is presently secured in a locked cabinet in the study of Charles Bellamy's house in Grosvenor Square. You speak, Mr. Harcourt, as though the document were still secure, is it not? It is, so far as I know, Mr. Holmes, perfectly secure. But I confess I have not been easy in my mind since it left the country, and I have come to ask whether you would consent to look in upon the household, quietly, and satisfy yourself, and me, that all is as it should be. There is a great deal of money at stake, and where there is a great deal of money, Mr. Holmes, there are generally a great many people who might wish to see it diverted. Holmes regarded him for a long moment with that curious, unblinking attention, which I had come to recognise as the outward sign of a mind already several steps in advance of the conversation. "You had better tell me," said he at last, "precisely who has access to this cabinet, and to the document within it." Harcourt required no persuasion, and proceeded to name them one by one, checking each upon his fingers, as though he had rehearsed the list upon his journey to Baker Street. There was Charles Bellamy himself, the heir, a courteous young man whom Harcourt described as embarrassed by debts incurred before his father's death, and eager beyond measure to see the railway sale concluded. There was Miss Eleanor Bellamy, his sister, whom Harcourt praised as possessing more sense than her brother, and a keener interest in the family's affairs than most young ladies were permitted to show. There was Mr. Julian Crewe, a surveyor engaged to verify the boundaries described in the patent against the modern maps, an ambitious young man of humble origins, who had, Harcourt admitted reluctantly, some acquaintance with the gaming tables. There was Colonel Arthur Vane, an old friend of Sir Matthew's, whose own estate marched with the disputed acreage, and who stood, Harcourt allowed, to benefit considerably should the Bellamy title be overturned. And there was, finally, Mr. Philip Marsh. "My own senior clerk," said Harcourt, with the faint dismissive fondness one reserves for old furniture. "He has been with the firm 20 years, Mr. Holmes, has copied more deeds than I have read, and organised the whole of the Bellamy papers with his own hand. A most obliging, most methodical man. I should as soon suspect my umbrella stand." "You would be surprised, Mr. Harcourt, how frequently the umbrella stand proves the more interesting article," said Holmes, though he said it lightly, and I did not then attach to the remark the weight it perhaps deserved. He rose and walked twice the length of the room, his hands clasped behind him, before turning again to our visitor. "One question before you go. Who, precisely, has handled the original patent within these past several days? Held it, examined it, turned its pages?" Harcourt considered. "Why, nearly all of them, Mr. Holmes. Charles and Eleanor naturally, as it is their inheritance. Crewe, in the course of his survey work. Marsh, in preparing it for storage. Even Colonel Vane looked it over, I believe, on a visit some days past, though he has always maintained a scrupulous distance from the family's private affairs." "Then we have discovered nothing whatever," said Holmes, and smiled in the manner that I had learned to associate with the discovery of something considerable. "We have not yet found who had access to the patent, Watson. We have merely found who wishes us to believe that access is the question that matters." Harcourt, plainly puzzled by this observation, rose to take his leave, extracting from Holmes a promise that we would call upon the Bellamy household the following morning. When the door had closed behind him and his footsteps had faded upon the stair, I asked Holmes what he had meant by his final remark. He did not answer directly, but stood for some time gazing into the fire, his pipe unlit between his fingers. "A guarded document, Watson, in a locked cabinet, in a house full of people with reason to wish it altered, lost, or destroyed," said he at last. "It has the shape of a very simple problem. I distrust simple shapes. We shall see tomorrow whether this one holds it honestly." With that he would say no more, and I was left, as so often, to pass the remainder of the evening in the company of my own unsatisfied curiosity, while the fog pressed close against the glass and the sealing wax cooled, forgotten upon its sources. Chapter 2. The Cabinet in Grosvenor Square. The fog had thinned somewhat by the following morning, though it had not lifted so much as retreated into the corners of the streets, lying in wait beneath archways and along the railings of the squares, as though reluctant to abandon the city altogether. Holmes had risen before me, and I found him at breakfast already dressed for the day, a slice of toast forgotten in his hand while he read, for the third time by his own admission, a small notebook in which he had copied Harcourt's list of names. "You are struck by something in that list," I observed, taking my seat. "I am struck by its completeness," said he. "A list in which everyone has access is very nearly as useful as a list in which no one has. It tells us that the thief, whoever he proves to be, need not have contrived some elaborate stratagem to gain entrance to that cabinet. He had only to wait for an unwatched moment. That is a very different sort of criminal from the one Lestrade will imagine, Watson, and I have no doubt he is already imagining him." We reached Grosvenor Square a little before 10, and were admitted by a manservant of gravely correct bearing into a hall, hung with the sort of ancestral portraits that a family purchases rather than inherits when its fortunes begin to rise. Charles Bellamy met us in the hall itself, a fair-haired young man of perhaps 30, whose handsome countenance was marred by the particular pallor of a man who has slept badly for reasons he cannot confide even to himself. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I am glad you have come, though I confess I hardly know what there is for you to see. The patent is quite safe." "Then I shall have the pleasure of an uneventful morning," said Holmes pleasantly, "which is a pleasure I am rarely afforded. May we see the cabinet?" Bellamy led us through to what had evidently been his father's study, a comfortable book-lined room with a tall window overlooking the square, and there, against the inner wall, stood a narrow cabinet of dark mahogany, its brass fittings dulled with age rather than neglect. Bellamy drew a key from his watch-chain and turned it in a lock of unusual intricacy. "A Brahma," Holmes murmured, bending to examine it before the key had fully completed its turn. "Your father chose well. These are not opened with a bent wire, Watson, whatever the sensational papers may tell you." He straightened. "This is the only key?" "The only one, Mr. Holmes. It has not left my chain since my father's death." "And who besides yourself has had occasion to open this cabinet in recent days?" Bellamy considered. "Harcourt, of course, when he brought the patent up from the country. Crewe, to make his survey notes. My sister has seen it. Marsh came with Harcourt to arrange the papers properly. He has a positive genius for order, has Marsh, and could not bear to see the patent lying loose among father's other documents. Colonel Vane called the same afternoon, though I believe he never came into this room at all. He and I spoke in the drawing-room the whole time." "You believe? You did not then remain with him every moment?" A faint colour rose in Bellamy's face. "I stepped out once to fetch a bottle of the '68 port he's fond of. I was gone no more than a few minutes." Holmes made no comment upon this, but I saw him note it, in the manner he had of appearing to forget a fact utterly while in reality filing it away past all forgetting. He turned instead to a thorough examination of the room, and I confess that even I, familiar as I was with his methods, found myself hard-pressed to guess what he sought among furnishings so entirely ordinary. He began upon his knees before the cabinet itself, and I heard him give a small sound of satisfaction. "A crescent of dust, Watson, beneath the cabinet's foot, pale and disturbed only along its forward edge. The cabinet has been drawn out from the wall and pushed back again, and not so very long ago." He rose and crossed to the desk, where he bent close over the leather top and drew out his lens. "And here, a smear of ink, blue-black, upon the inner edge, where a careless hand might rest a pen while consulting a document rather than writing upon it." He moved next to the hearth, from which he extracted with the delicacy of a surgeon 3 small fragments of charred paper, thin and translucent even in their burning, which he held to the light before folding them into an envelope. tracing paper," said he, "and burned deliberately, I think, rather than thrown carelessly upon a dying fire. See how each fragment has curled inward from a corner, as paper does when it is fed to flame a piece at a time." "Crewe's tracings," I ventured. "He is the surveyor, after all." "Perhaps." Holmes did not seem greatly moved by the discovery. He passed next to the window, where he discovered a narrow scratch upon the floorboards, some inches from the sill, and finally to the curtain, whose cord he lifted between two fingers and studied with an attention quite disproportionate, it seemed to me, to so trivial an object. "A curious knot for a curtain cord," said he at length. "Watson, do you recognise it?" I confessed I did not, beyond observing that it was tied with more complexity than the household's housemaids commonly employed. "It is a surveyor's knot," said Holmes, "or something got up to resemble one. We shall return to it." It was at this juncture that Inspector Lestrade arrived, having been summoned, Bellamy explained, as a precaution against the very theft that had not yet occurred, and finding instead a ready-made mystery to occupy him. He greeted Holmes with a wary cordiality the two had long maintained, and at once declared his suspicions fixed upon Julian Crewe, whom he characterized, before that gentleman had even entered the room, as a young man with expensive tastes and an income that does not support them. Crewe himself, summoned shortly after, proved to be a lean, quick-eyed fellow of perhaps 28, whose manner was defensive from the first word, as though he had already been tried and found wanting in some court of public opinion. He admitted readily enough, under Lestrade's questioning, to having made a tracing of a portion of the patent's boundary description for the purposes, he insisted, of his survey work, and nothing more. Lestrade regarded this admission with the satisfaction of a man who has found precisely what he expected to find, and I own that I shared something of his conviction. But Holmes appeared curiously indifferent to Crewe's tracing, and instead had turned his attention to a quiet, grey-whiskered man who had entered behind the others, and begun, without being asked, to gather the scattered papers upon the desk and restore them methodically to their proper folders. "Mr. Marsh, I think," said Holmes. The clerk looked up with a mild and unremarkable smile. "I am, sir. Forgive me. Habit. I cannot abide disorder among papers, wherever I find it." I noticed, as he continued his quiet work, that he used his left hand exclusively, turning each folder with a small practised motion. "You are left-handed, Mr. Marsh?" Holmes inquired, in a tone so idle that I nearly missed the sharpness beneath it. "From birth, sir." "No, I beg your pardon, that is not quite accurate. I injured my right wrist as a boy, falling from a hayloft, and never regained its full use. I have written left-handed these 40 years. Holmes thanked him and said no more upon the subject, though I observed that his eyes had not left Marsh's hands throughout the whole of this small exchange. When we had at last taken our leave of the household, and were walking together through the thinning fog toward Oxford Street, I remarked that Marsh seemed the least likely person in the house to trouble anyone. "He is an admirable clerk," said Holmes. I took this, as I have said, for simple praise, and pressed him no further, though something in the flatness of his tone might have warned me that he intended a great deal more by it than the words themselves conveyed. Holmes did not choose to explain, and I, familiar with the futility of pressing him before he was ready, held my peace and turned up my collar against the returning damp. Chapter 3. The Empty Portfolio. I was wakened the next morning by a commotion upon the stair that I recognised, even through the fog of sleep, as the particular urgency of ill tidings. By the time I had drawn on my dressing gown and descended, I found Edmund Harcourt already in our sitting-room, his silk hat discarded upon the table, and his composure, so carefully maintained at our first meeting, entirely abandoned. "It is gone, Mr. Holmes," said he, before either of us had spoken a word of greeting. "The patent, it is gone." Holmes, who had been shaving when the bell rang and had come down with the razor still in his hand, set the implement upon the mantel with a deliberation that struck me, even at such a moment, as characteristic. "Sit down, Mr. Harcourt, and tell me precisely what has happened, and in what order you learned of it. Harcourt required a moment to compose himself before he could comply. Charles Bellamy went to the cabinet shortly before breakfast this morning. Merely, he says, to look over the document once more before his solicitors' meeting this afternoon. The cabinet was locked, exactly as it should have been. His key had never left his chain. He swears to this most solemnly, and I believe him. He unlocked it, drew out the leather portfolio in which the patent has always been kept, Harcourt's voice caught, and found it empty. The portfolio itself remained, entirely undisturbed, Mr. Holmes, lying precisely where it has always lain. Only its contents were gone. Holmes was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed upon some point beyond the window. A locked cabinet, opened by its only key, containing a portfolio undisturbed but for its contents. That is a very particular sort of theft, Mr. Harcourt, the sort that troubles itself to leave everything as it found it, save for the one thing that mattered. Come, Watson, I think we had best see this empty portfolio for ourselves before Lestrade's boots have obscured whatever remains to be read there. We found, upon arriving in Grosvenor Square, that Lestrade had already taken vigorous possession of the case, and had, moreover, arrived at a theory with a speed that did him credit as a man of action, whatever it may have lacked as an exercise in logic. "It's plain enough, Mr. Holmes," said he, meeting us in the hall with the satisfaction of a man who has solved a puzzle before his rival has finished reading the box. "Somebody got hold of young Bellamy's key, copied it most like, or borrowed it long enough to take a wax impression, let themselves in during the night, took the document and let themselves out again, locking up nice and tidy behind them, and I fancy I know who." "Crewe," said Holmes without much inflection. "Crewe," Lestrade confirmed, with the air of a man producing a trump card. "We've been to his rooms this morning, Mr. Holmes, on a warrant, and I don't mind telling you we found more than enough to answer for. A drawing of the cabinet lock near enough to a working diagram, measurements of this very house, taken off in a surveyor's hand, sheets of paper with phrases copied out that match the patent word for word, and a letter from a moneylender in the city, demanding a debt paid within the fortnight, or facing consequences he'd rather not have discussed in a magistrate's court. A formidable case, Holmes agreed. What does Crewe say to it? That the measurements were architectural, something to do with checking the boundary survey against the house's own foundation lines, whatever that may mean. That the copied phrases were needed for his report. He'd say the moon was made of Cheshire cheese if he thought it might save his neck, Mr. Holmes, and I'm not inclined to credit a word of it. Holmes made no reply to this beyond a small non-committal inclination of the head, and asked instead to be shown the portfolio. It lay, when we reached the study, upon Bellamy's desk, a slim article of black leather, its interior lined with two retaining straps designed to hold a folded document secure against its owner's person or within a locked drawer. Holmes took it up and turned it toward the window light, running his thumb along the inner surface of each strap in turn. "These have been stretched, Watson. See how the leather here has lost its natural curve and taken instead a slightly flattened set, as though it were made to accommodate something thicker than the document it was designed for." He held the strap closer to my eye. "And here, fainter but unmistakable, the impression of a folded edge, considerably thicker than 60-year-old paper has any business being." "You mean the patent that lay in this portfolio was not the same thickness as the one Harcourt describes?" "I mean that something of a different character occupied this space, and did so for long enough to leave its mark upon the leather. Whether that something was the true patent in some altered state, or another document entirely, I am not yet prepared to say." He set the portfolio down and dropped to one knee beside the cabinet, exploring the narrow gap beneath its foot with careful fingers. After a moment he rose, holding between finger and thumb a fragment scarcely larger than a grain of rice. "What is it?" I asked. "Sealing wax," said he, "and green, unless my eyes deceive me in this light." He turned to Harcourt, who had followed us into the room with an expression of a man watching his own fortune examined under a microscope. "Does the Bellamy family or your own office employ green wax for any of its documents?" Harcourt shook his head with some emphasis. "Never, Mr. Holmes. The Bellamy seal has always been struck in red. It is a point of some pride with the family, I believe, going back several generations. I've never known green wax used in connection with any Bellamy paper in the 30 years I have served the estate." "Curious," said Holmes, and folded the fragment into a twist of paper, which he placed in his breast pocket without further comment. I expected him to press the point, but he asked no more questions upon the subject, and turned instead to a fresh examination of the room's other features. The position of the waste-paper basket, which he noted had been moved some inches from its accustomed place beneath the desk, and the ash within the grate, which he stirred gently with a pencil before pronouncing it, somewhat cryptically, consistent, but not conclusive. Lestrade, growing impatient with what he plainly regarded as needless refinement, pressed Holmes for his opinion upon Crewe's guilt. "My opinion, Inspector, is that you have assembled a very persuasive case," said Holmes, "and that persuasive cases are the ones I have learned most to distrust. A man clever enough to counterfeit a Bramah key and slip past a sleeping household does not, as a rule, leave his measurements and his tracings lying about his rooms for the first constable to find. But I shall not ask you to take my word against your evidence. Give me a day, and I will either strengthen your case beyond challenge or dismantle it beyond repair." Lestrade grumbled, but agreed, and we took our leave of Grosvenor Square as a cold and colourless noon settled over the square outside. The fog held at bay for the moment, though I fancied, from the look of the sky, that it would return with the evening. Chapter 4. The Footprint in the Fog. The case against Julian Crewe, which had seemed to me formidable enough upon the previous afternoon, acquired by evening a completeness that left little room, I thought, for further doubt. Lestrade called upon us at Baker Street shortly after 7, his coat still damp from the returning fog, and laid before us the fresh intelligence with the unmistakable relish of a man whose instincts have been vindicated. "A housemaid at the Bellamy establishment has come forward, Mr. Holmes," said he, seating himself without waiting to be asked and warming his hands before our fire. "She could not sleep. Toothache, she says, and happened to be at her window a little after midnight, which looks down upon the mews at the rear of the square. She saw a man leave by the garden door in a long dark coat, carrying what she describes as a rectangular case, of the sort a surveyor might use for his instruments. A precise description for a girl roused from her bed at midnight with a toothache," Holmes observed. "Precise enough to matter, at any rate, for we found footprints beneath the study window to match it, boot prints, in the soft ground of the flower bed, that our sergeant compared this afternoon against a pair taken from Crewe's own lodgings. He'll not talk his way past that, I fancy. And the window itself? Latch scraped fresh, as though forced with a thin blade. Crewe's a surveyor, Mr. Holmes. He'd know a boundary wall from a garden fence, but he'd know a window latch too, I don't doubt, from all the empty houses he's had to measure up in the course of his trade." Holmes received this intelligence with an attention that gave no sign, one way or the other, of his private conclusions, and asked only whether Crewe had been confronted with the footprints. "He denies it, naturally. Says he was at his lodgings the whole of that night, though his landlady can only swear he was in by 11, and cannot say he did not go out again after. And there's more besides, Mr. Holmes. Colonel Vane called on us this afternoon, most reluctant, he said, to speak against a young man he'd rather liked, but feeling it his duty. He tells us that Crewe came to him privately, some days before the theft, and asked him, casual as you like over a glass of sherry, what the disputed acreage might fetch, supposing the Bellamy claim were to fail. "Did he indeed?" said Holmes softly. "He did. And that, Mr. Holmes, is a young man who had already begun reckoning the value of a crime before he'd committed it. I've taken Crewe into custody this evening. I thought you'd wish to know before you read it in the morning papers." When Lestrade had gone, well pleased with himself and with the case he carried, I turned to Holmes and confessed that I found the evidence, taken altogether, very nearly overwhelming. "Do you," said Holmes, without turning from the fire into which he had been gazing throughout the latter part of Lestrade's recital, "the footprints, the latch, the case seen leaving the house, Vane's testimony, even Crewe's own gambling debts, it wants only a confession, surely." "It wants a great deal more than that, Watson. though I grant you it has been dressed to appear otherwise." He rose at last and crossed to the table where he kept his notes upon the case, drawing out the small sketch he had made of the Bellamy study on our first visit. "Let us consider these footprints. You will recall, if you examine the plan I made, that the flower bed lies immediately beneath the study window, and that the garden door by which our midnight visitor supposedly departed lies some 15 yards distant, around the corner of the house. What of it? Only this, that the footprints beneath the window point toward the house, Watson, not away from it. A man descending from that window, having completed his theft, would leave prints heading outward, toward the garden and the mews beyond. These point in the opposite direction entirely, as though their maker approached the window rather than fled from it, or more probably, as though they were never made by a man walking at all, but pressed into the earth by some other means, and pointed as their maker judged would tell the better story. I own that this observation, though ingeniously reasoned, struck me as thin ground upon which to acquit a man against whom so much else had been amassed, and I said as much. "There is more," said Holmes. "I examined the sill myself this morning, while Lestrade's attention was engaged elsewhere, and found the mud upon it dry beneath its upper layer. Dry, Watson, though the night in question was a wet one, and any mud genuinely transferred from a boot. Climbing that sill would have been wet through top to bottom, and would have dried as a single mass, not in layers. Mud that dries in layers has been applied in layers, smeared on, allowed partly to dry, and smeared again, which is not the manner of a man's boot brushing against a window frame in the dark, but the manner of a man's hand, working with deliberate patience in daylight or by candle, to manufacture the appearance of a thing that never happened. This gave me pause, though I confess I did not yet grasp its full significance. And the knot upon the curtain cord? You said we should return to it. We shall return to it now." Holmes drew from his pocket-book a small diagram he had made of the knot in question, comparing it, as he spoke, against a similar sketch obtained, he did not say how, from among Crewe's own survey papers. A surveyor's knot, Watson, has a particular character. It is tied by long habit in a manner that favours the right hand, looping first to the left and drawing tight with a motion no man forms twice the same way by accident. The knot upon that curtain cord is the mirror of it, tied backwards, as a man ties a bow when he has learned the movement only by watching another do it in a glass, or by imitating a memory rather than a habit. You mean someone attempted to imitate Crewe's own knot, and betrayed himself in the attempt? I mean precisely that. A man may study another's hand closely enough to copy his letters upon a page, Watson, and yet betray himself the moment he must copy a motion rather than a shape. For a shape may be studied and reproduced with the eye alone, but a motion is learned only through repetition, and repetition leaves habits that cannot be borrowed for a single night's work. I confessed that these were ingenious observations, but pointed out, not unreasonably I thought, that Lestrade would regard them as trifles beside the weight of footprints, scraped latches, and a housemaid's sworn testimony. He will, Holmes agreed without apparent distress at the prospect. Lestrade builds his cases as a mason builds a wall, Watson, brick upon brick, each one solid enough on its own account, until the whole stands foursquare and looks unanswerable. But a wall built of borrowed bricks is no less a wall for standing upright, and I have found, in the whole course of my experience, that the cleverest walls are built by men who never once intended them to be examined by anyone patient enough to test each brick in turn. He knocked out his pipe against the grate, and regarded the dying fire with an expression I had come to recognise as the herald of long and solitary thought. Tomorrow, I think, we must stop asking who could have committed this theft, and begin asking instead who required us to believe, so very earnestly that Crewe had done so. Chapter 5. 5 Versions of an Afternoon. Holmes announced at breakfast that he intended to interview each member of the Bellamy household in turn, and I own that I anticipated, from the manner of his announcement, some searching examination of alibis, some rigorous inquiry into who had been where at the hour the theft was thought to have occurred. I was mistaken in this, as I so often was in anticipating the precise shape of his methods, for when we arrived once more in Grosvenor Square, Holmes asked of each person he interviewed a question so unassuming that I might have thought it idle chatter had I not learned by then to distrust anything in Holmes that wore the appearance of idleness. "I do not wish to know who took the patent," he told Charles Bellamy, when that young man had been shown into the drawing-room and seated somewhat nervously before us. "I wish to know how you spent the afternoon before it vanished. Every quarter hour of it, so far as memory serves, from the moment the document was returned to this house until the moment you retired for the night." Bellamy, plainly relieved to be asked something so far short of an accusation, gave his account readily enough. He had placed the patent in the cabinet himself, he said, at very nearly 5 o'clock, having examined it that morning with Harcourt and being satisfied that it required no further handling before the solicitors' meeting. He had then gone out to his club, dined there, and returned a little before 11, at which hour the household had already retired. Eleanor Bellamy, summoned next, proved as her brother had described her, a young woman of quick intelligence and a directness of manner rather unusual, I thought, in one of her age and situation. Her account differed from her brother's in one small particular. She recalled seeing the patent still lying upon the desk, not yet returned to the cabinet close at 5:30, when she had come into the study to fetch a book and found Marsh still occupied with the family's papers. "You are quite certain of the hour?" Holmes asked. "Quite certain, Mr. Holmes. I recollect it because the church clock in the square struck the half-hour as I left the room, and I remarked to myself that Mr. Marsh was working later than his custom, for he is generally gone by 5. Harcourt, questioned in his turn, recalled a detail that neither Bellamy had mentioned, that he had watched Marsh prepare the leather portfolio itself before the patent was finally laid within it and the cabinet locked, smoothing its interior, as he put it, with the particular care the man gives to everything, as though a crease in the leather were a personal affront. Colonel Vane, when his turn came, was brief to the point of curtness, and repeated what he had already told Lestrade, that he had spent the whole of his visit in the drawing-room, and had never once set foot in the study. He seemed, I thought, a shade too emphatic upon this point, though I could not have said why the emphasis struck me as excessive rather than merely natural in a man conscious of standing under suspicion. Crewe we did not see, he being still detained upon Lestrade's warrant, but Holmes had already obtained his account from the inspector's own notes, in which the surveyor admitted freely to having handled the patent that same afternoon, in order to confirm a boundary description against his own measurements, and to having returned it, as he insisted, entirely intact to the desk. It was Philip Marsh, questioned last of all, who furnished by far the most complete account of the 5. He recalled, with what struck me as really quite remarkable precision, the exact order in which each person had come and gone from the study. Crewe first, departing shortly after 4, then Eleanor at 5:30, as she herself had said, then Harcourt, who had left to keep an appointment at 6, and Bellamy last of all, at very nearly 7, some while after the patent had been secured. Marsh even recollected, unprompted, that the study fire had burned low and very nearly gone out shortly after 6, and that he had built it up again himself before finally taking his own leave a little before 6:30. "A most exact memory, Mr. Marsh," said Holmes, when the clerk had finished. "I am accustomed to accounts a good deal less orderly than yours." Marsh permitted himself a small, deprecating smile. "It is the habit of my profession, Mr. Holmes. 20 years of copying deeds teaches a man to notice small things, and to remember them, whether he wishes to or no." When Marsh had withdrawn to resume his ordering of the household's papers, Holmes sat for some minutes without speaking, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, gazing at a point somewhere beyond the window that I did not think was fixed upon anything in the square outside. "You're impressed by his account," I ventured, "as I confess I am myself. It is the clearest of the 5 by a considerable margin." "I am impressed," said Holmes, "though perhaps not in the manner you suppose. Consider, Watson, how memory ordinarily behaves. Ask 5 people to recount an ordinary afternoon, and you will receive 5 accounts that agree upon the broad shape of events and disagree, often considerably, upon their particulars. An hour misremembered here, an order of departure confused there, a detail recalled by one and utterly forgotten by another. That is the natural imperfection of an unrehearsed memory, and I have learned to trust it precisely because it is imperfect. And Marsh's account bears none of these imperfections. Marsh's account bears none of them whatever. He has given us the hour of every departure, the state of the fire, the very words with which Miss Bellamy remarked upon his lateness, a completeness so far beyond the ordinary that I am driven to a conclusion you may find uncharitable. Memory that precise, Watson, is rarely memory at all. More often it is preparation, an account composed beforehand, rehearsed until it runs smooth, and delivered now with a fluency that betrays, by its very perfection, the labour that went into its construction. I confess I found this reasoning difficult to credit, for Marsh had seemed to me, throughout our several encounters, the very picture of an innocent and obliging servant, without guile enough to construct so elaborate a deception. I said as much to Holmes. "That, Watson, is precisely the impression a clever man labours hardest to create," said he, and rose to gather his hat and stick. "I should like to see some specimens of Mr. Marsh's handwriting, not his recent work, which I have already examined at Harcourt's office, but examples spanning the whole of his 20 years' service, if Harcourt can be persuaded to produce them. There is a small matter of a single letter, formed a certain way for the better part of 2 decades, and lately formed rather differently, that I find I cannot dismiss from my mind." I asked him what significance a change in handwriting could possibly bear upon a stolen land patent, but Holmes, characteristically, declined to satisfy my curiosity, remarking only that a man's hand, like his knot-tying, was a habit built upon years of repetition, and that habits, once broken, were rarely broken without a reason worth discovering. Chapter 6. A name beneath another name. We spent the whole of the following day not upon the theft itself, but upon a labour so far removed from Grosvenor Square that I might have supposed, had I not known Holmes better, that he had abandoned the case entirely in favour of some antiquarian curiosity. He had obtained from Harcourt, not without difficulty, a bundle of Marsh's earliest copying work, dating back nearly to the man's first engagement with the firm, and these he spread across our sitting-room table beside more recent specimens, comparing them beneath his lens with the silent, absorbed patience I had seen him bring to bear upon far bloodier matters. "There," said he at last, indicating a capital letter that recurred by my count some dozen times across the older documents. "Observe the flourish upon this letter M, Watson. A small backward loop at its close, present in every specimen from Marsh's first 5 years of service until, so far as I can discover, a period no more than 18 months past. And here," he laid a recent deed alongside the others, "the loop has vanished. The letter is formed more simply, more quickly, in a hand that any careless eye would call the same, and that I confess very nearly deceived my own, until I set the 2 beside each other under this light. Men's handwriting changes, Holmes, over so many years. My own has altered considerably since my student days. It does change, yes, gradually, as the hand tires or the eye weakens, and such changes come upon a man by degrees, over years, touching every letter a little, rather than one letter entirely. This is not that kind of change. This is a man who has deliberately unlearned a habit, who has practised, I should think in private and at some cost of patience, to remove from his hand a single distinctive mark that a person familiar with an earlier specimen of his writing might otherwise have recognised. I asked him what earlier specimen he had in mind, and it was this question, more than any deduction drawn from ink and paper, that sent us that afternoon to the dusty upper rooms of a legal registry in Chancery Lane, where Holmes spent above 2 hours in consultation with a clerk of prodigious memory for old scandals. and emerged at last with an account that he related to me only once we were again in a cab rattling homeward through the gathering dusk. Some 30 years ago, Watson, a young law clerk by the name of Peter Marston, was dismissed from a provincial solicitor's office in Hertfordshire, under an accusation of having altered certain property records in connection with a land speculation that failed disastrously for all concerned. The accusation was never proved in a court of law. Marston vanished before the matter could be brought to trial, but it was believed absolutely by the solicitor who made it, a Mr. Josiah Fenwick, who pursued the young man's disgrace with considerable energy through every legal circle in the county, and this concerns our Marsh Howe. Fenwick, Watson, was for many years the closest professional associate of Sir Matthew Bellamy, and it was through Fenwick's introduction, the registry clerk tells me, that Bellamy first came to hold the disputed acreage now at the centre of our railway negotiations. That is the first thread. The second is this. He drew from his pocketbook a description, copied in his own hand from some ancient file, of the vanished Marston. His age, his height, the colour of his hair, and, most significant of all, a note that he had suffered, as a boy, an injury to his right wrist that left him unable to write with that hand for the remainder of his life. I confess that even I, unpractised as I was in Holmes's particular arithmetic of coincidence, saw at once where this account was tending. You believe Marsh and Marston are the same man. The ages correspond, allowing 30 years' passage. The initials correspond, if one supposes a man wishing to vanish might choose a name near enough his own to answer to it without thinking, yet far enough to defeat a casual inquiry. And the injury corresponds most exactly of all. A right wrist ruined in boyhood is not so common an affliction that two men should share it by chance, both employed at different times in the same narrow trade of copying deeds. Holmes gazed out at the fog-wrapped streets sliding past the cab window. I do not think Philip Marsh injured his wrist falling from a hayloft, Watson. I think Peter Marston injured his wrist 30 years ago, and has told the same convenient story ever since, because a story once settled upon is safer than the truth, however small a lie it costs to maintain it. But what motive could this give him? A grudge against a solicitor 30 years dead cannot account for a land patent stolen last week. No, Holmes agreed, a grudge alone could not. But I did not stop my inquiries with Marston's disgrace. I asked also after the land itself, the disputed acreage that Colonel Vane covets, and that the railway company now wishes to purchase at so extraordinary a price. It did not, Watson, always belong to the Bellamy estate. He explained, as our cab turned into Baker Street, that the registry clerk had traced the acreage's history a full generation further back than Harcourt himself appeared to know, or at least had troubled to mention, and had found that the land had originally formed part of a small freehold belonging to one Josiah Marston, Peter's father, before a boundary amendment, executed under circumstances the registry's own notes described only as irregular, transferred a considerable portion of it into Sir Matthew Bellamy's hands. If the original patent contains, as I begin to suspect it may, some clause or notation proving that amendment invalid, said Holmes as we climbed the stairs to our rooms, then Philip Marsh, or Peter Marston, if we are to call him rightly, has spent 20 years in Harcourt's employ, sitting within arm's reach of the very document that could restore to his family what was taken from his father. That is motive enough for any man, Watson, and more than enough for one who has already shown himself willing to unlearn his own handwriting, rather than be known. I own that I found the case, upon hearing this, very nearly complete, and said so with some satisfaction, as we settled once more before our fire. Holmes, however, shook his head slowly, filling his pipe with the deliberate care he reserved for problems not yet solved to his own satisfaction. You mistake completeness for certainty, Watson, as men so often do. If Marsh wished only to see that patent destroyed, to erase the proof of his father's loss so that it might never be raised against him, or simply to deny the Bellamy family the fruits of an old injustice, he has had 20 years in which to burn it, and 100 quiet opportunities to do so unobserved. A man patient enough to alter his own handwriting over months rather than risk Sudden discovery is not a man who acts upon impulse. Why then did he wait? Why choose this particular week of all the weeks in 20 years to act at last? He struck a match and drew upon his pipe until the tobacco caught. That, Watson, and not the identity of our thief, is the true mystery that remains before us. Chapter 7. The Patent in the Surveyor's Case. The question Holmes had posed himself upon the previous evening, why Marsh should have waited 20 years to act and chosen this particular week above all others, seemed destined, for a time, to remain unanswered, for the investigation was overtaken the following morning by an event that appeared, upon its face, to close the case entirely. A note reached Scotland Yard shortly after dawn. Unsigned and composed, Lestrade told us when he called upon us in some excitement of words cut from a newspaper and pasted upon a common sheet, directing the police to a storage locker in a small establishment near Charing Cross Station. There, within a locked wooden box rented some weeks previously, under a name the proprietor could not with certainty attach to any face, the police discovered Julian Crewe's own rectangular surveyor's case, the very case, Lestrade insisted, that the housemaid had seen carried from the Bellamy garden door at midnight, and within that case, wrapped in a square of oiled cloth, lay the missing Bellamy land patent. "You will forgive me, Mr. Holmes, if I permit myself a measure of satisfaction," said Lestrade, when he had conducted us to the yard to view the recovered document for ourselves. "I do not say the anonymous note was Crewe's own doing. A confederate, perhaps, growing nervous and wishing the whole business ended before it implicated him further. But there is no explaining away a stolen document found inside a stolen man's own instrument case. Charles Bellamy, Harcourt and Eleanor were summoned in turn to identify the patent, and each did so without hesitation. The seals were as they remembered them. The creases where the document had lain folded for 60 years fell precisely where each recalled seeing them. The faint browning of age along the margins, the particular slant of the copying clerk's hand who had first engrossed it so many decades before, all corresponded, Harcourt declared, exactly to his memory of the original. Crewe, confronted with the discovery in his cell, protested his innocence with what struck even Lestrade, I think, as a rather exhausted sincerity, insisting that he had never rented any locker near Charing Cross in his life, and could produce no explanation whatever for how his own case had come to be used in so damning a fashion. "He would say that," Lestrade observed to us afterward, though I fancied there was rather less conviction in his voice than there had been the previous day. Wouldn't any man, faced with evidence of this weight? I confess that I found myself very nearly persuaded that the affair had reached its natural conclusion, whatever lingering doubts Holmes's earlier observations had planted in my mind. A stolen document, recovered, a guilty man, identified by evidence that even his accomplices, if such existed, had been unable to conceal. It wanted only a trial to complete the matter. Holmes alone remained unsatisfied. He had said almost nothing throughout the whole of the morning's proceedings, but had asked, upon our arrival at the yard, that the recovered patent be brought to a private room where we might examine it without interruption, and there he remained for above half an hour, bent low over the document with his lens, turning it this way and that beneath the lamp, while Lestrade and I waited with what patience we could muster. "You're dissatisfied," I said at last, unable to contain my curiosity further, even now with the document itself in hand. "I am dissatisfied," Holmes agreed without looking up, "precisely because the document is in hand, a theft that ends with the stolen article recovered, and the thief conveniently identified by evidence he was careless enough to leave lying about his own rooms, has the shape less of a crime than of a performance, Watson, and I have grown suspicious this past week of shapes that fit together rather too neatly." He straightened at last and turned to Harcourt, who had lingered in the doorway throughout the examination, watching with an anxiety he made no effort to conceal. "Mr. Harcourt, I wonder if you would indulge me in a small matter of professional history. When your firm sealed legal copies some 20 years ago, deeds, conveyances, documents of that character, what colour wax did your office generally employ?" Harcourt appeared startled by so unexpected a question, coming as it did after so exhaustive an examination of the document's more obvious features. "Why, red, for the most part, Mr. Holmes, as I told you before. Though my father, who headed the firm in those years, had something of a fondness for green wax upon occasion, a small vanity of his, I always thought, to distinguish his own hand upon a document from that of his clerks. He used it, if I recall rightly, only for copies he had personally witnessed and sealed himself, and abandoned the practice some years before his death." Holmes looked down once more at the patent spread upon the table before him, and I saw his eyes come to rest upon one of the several seals that secured its folds, a seal that showed, even to my own less practised eye once Holmes had drawn my attention to it, a faint but unmistakable tint of green beneath its aged and darkened surface. "There is a green seal upon this document, Mr. Harcourt," said Holmes quietly. Harcourt bent to examine it himself, his brow furrowing. "So there is, Mr. Holmes, though I confess I attach no great significance to it, if my father did occasionally use such wax in his time." "Perhaps not," said Holmes, though something in his tone suggested that he attached a very great significance to it indeed. He said nothing further upon the point, but folded his hands and regarded the document for a long moment in silence, while Lestrade shifted with evident impatience at his elbow. "Well, Mr. Holmes," the inspector demanded at last, "are we to have your blessing upon this recovery, or must Crewe wait upon your further pleasure before we can call the matter settled?" Holmes rose slowly from his chair, and when he spoke, it was with a gravity that silenced even Lestrade's impatience. "This document, Inspector, has told us a great deal more, I think, than its finders intended it to tell. It has all but solved the question of who removed it from Grosvenor Square, and I believe I can now answer that question with some confidence. But in solving that question, it has raised another, far more troubling than the first." He looked from Lestrade to Harcourt, and I saw in his face the particular stillness that I had learned, over years of friendship, to associate with conclusions he found more distasteful than satisfying. "This document, gentlemen, has also proved beyond reasonable doubt that it is not the patent it claims to be. Whatever we have recovered from that locker near Charing Cross, it is not the 60-year-old grant that once secured the Bellamy fortune. It is a forgery, and a very accomplished one." Chapter 8. The Seal That Should Have Cracked. Lestrade's face, upon hearing Holmes pronounce the recovered patent a forgery, passed through so rapid a succession of expressions, incredulity, indignation, and finally a sort of wounded suspicion, as though Holmes had contrived the discovery purely to embarrass him, that I might, under less serious circumstances, have found it comic. A forgery, Mr. Holmes? Bellamy himself identified it not 2 hours since, and Harcourt beside him, and Miss Bellamy a third time over. Are you telling me 3 people who have known that document the whole of their lives cannot recognise their own family's patent when it's placed before them? I am telling you, Inspector, that a forgery skilful enough to deceive 3 honest witnesses is not thereby proved genuine. It is only proved skilful. There is a considerable difference, and it is a difference upon which this whole inquiry now turns. Holmes drew the document once more beneath the lamp and beckoned us both closer. Observe this seal, gentlemen, the green one we discussed a moment ago, lying across this particular fold in the parchment. Mr. Harcourt, you have told me this fold has existed since the patent was first drawn some 60 years past. Is that your settled recollection? It is, Mr. Holmes. The document has always been kept folded in precisely this manner, in thirds along these same creases, for as long as I have known it, and my father before me, I believe, kept it folded no differently. Then consider what 60 years of folding and unfolding does to a crease in paper of this age and quality. The fibres along such a line grow weak, Watson, weaker with every repetition, until the crease itself becomes a kind of permanent scar upon the sheet, soft, whitened, and most significant of all, entirely incapable of supporting anything rigid laid across it without that rigid substance cracking along the same line. He touched the green seal with the tip of his pencil, careful not to disturb it. This seal crosses that very fold, gentlemen. Had it been applied to this document at any time reasonably close to its original sealing, 60 years ago, or even 20, when Mr. Harcourt's father is said to have favoured green wax upon occasion, the countless foldings since must inevitably have cracked it, for brittle wax cannot bend where paper bends beneath it without breaking, yet this seal is whole, unmarked, as pristine as the day it was pressed. I bent to examine it myself, and saw at once Holmes had directed my attention, that the wax indeed showed not the faintest fracture where the parchment's crease passed beneath it, though the crease itself was worn soft and pale, with evident age. The conclusion, Holmes continued, admits of only one honest reading. This seal was not applied 60 years ago, nor even 20. It was applied recently. Applied, in fact, after the paper beneath it had already acquired its aged folds, so that the wax, being fresh, has never yet been called upon to bend across a crease it did not create. The paper's old, gentlemen, I do not dispute that, but the seal that purports to authenticate it is new, and a seal newer than the document it seals is no seal at all, but a signature forged upon a genuine sheet of blank antiquity. Lestrade, to his credit, did not dismiss this reasoning as readily as he had dismissed the reverse knot and the misdirected footprints, but stood turning the implication over with a slow, deliberate frown of a man forcing himself to follow an argument he would rather not accept. "You mean to say, Mr. Holmes, that someone has taken an old sheet of paper, genuinely old, mind, and dressed it up with new seals and fresh ink to resemble the Bellamy patent closely enough to fool the family itself?" "I mean precisely that, and I think I can tell you now with some confidence how it was accomplished and why." Holmes straightened and began, in the manner I had seen him adopt so often before, to pace the narrow confines of the room as he assembled the pieces of his reconstruction aloud, as much, I think, to satisfy his own reasoning as to inform ours. "Consider the sequence of events, not as Lestrade first understood them, but as the evidence now compels us to understand them. The true patent was removed from Grosvenor Square not upon the night everyone supposes, Watson, but upon the very afternoon Harcourt first brought it to the house, removed quietly, during some unwatched interval while it lay upon the desk, perhaps while attention was drawn elsewhere by the ordinary business of the household. In its place, a forgery was substituted, a document already prepared, requiring only to be folded into the portfolio and left to rest there until its moment came. That is the thicker impression I found upon the leather straps, Watson. Not the true patent, whose thickness Harcourt could describe to the grain, but a substitute constructed with paper enough to hold a convincing set of folds, yet subtly, and only subtly, thicker than the original. "And the theft everyone believed had occurred from the locked cabinet?" I asked. "A second act entirely, performed some days later, once the substitute forgery had served its purpose of satisfying anyone who might glance into the portfolio without close examination. That forgery, too, was removed, quietly, I should think, by the same hand that placed it, and the elaborate stage business of a midnight burglary was constructed around its absence. The mud smeared in layers upon the sill, the footprints pointed the wrong direction, the curtain cord tied in a knot deliberately, if imperfectly, borrowed from Crewe's own habit. All of it designed for one purpose only, to convince Lestrade, and through Lestrade the world, that a theft had occurred upon a particular night, by a particular hand, so that suspicion might fall entire upon a man who had, in truth, touched nothing but the boundary description he freely admitted to tracing. "And the forgery found in Crewe's case this morning?" Lestrade demanded, though I thought his voice had lost a good deal of its earlier certainty. "Was planted there, Inspector, by the same patient hand that constructed every other piece of this elaborate misdirection, planted precisely so that its discovery would appear to close the case beyond further question, and so that everyone concerned, having found what they had been so carefully prepared to seek, would trouble themselves no further to ask whether they had found the right thing at all." Holmes paused in his pacing and regarded the false patent upon the table with something very near distaste. The footprints, the knot, the anonymous note directing you to Charing Cross, none of these were the work of a common thief seeking quick profit, Inspector. They were the work of a mind willing to labour for months, if not years, toward an end far more deliberate than simple gain. Then what became of the true patent, I asked, and who, in heaven's name, has gone to such lengths to hide its loss behind so false a recovery? Holmes turned from the table at last, and though his expression remained composed, I caught in his eyes a weariness that told me he had already answered the question to his own satisfaction, and found the answer no cause for triumph. The true patent, Watson, has not been destroyed. Whoever contrived this elaborate deception needed a great deal of time before the truth could safely emerge. Time enough, I think, to make some use of the genuine document before its disappearance was ever discovered as a forgery rather than a theft. That need for time, and not mere greed, is the key to this whole affair, and I believe I now understand precisely whose hand has been at work throughout. Come, I think we have imposed upon Mr. Harcourt's patience long enough today, but tomorrow I shall ask him, and one other besides, to meet us once more in Grosvenor Square, where I intend to lay this matter finally to rest. Chapter 9. Holmes reconstructs the crime. We assembled the following afternoon in the same study where the whole affair had begun, and I do not think I have often seen so curious a gathering under one roof. Charles and Eleanor Bellamy sat together near the window, the young man's face drawn with an anxiety he no longer troubled to conceal. Harcourt stood by the cold hearth, turning his hat between his hands. Colonel Vane occupied a chair somewhat apart from the others, his military bearing stiffened further, I thought, by evident displeasure at being summoned at all. And Philip Marsh, quiet and attentive as ever, waited near the desk with the same mild, obliging expression he had worn at every one of our previous encounters. Lestrade stood by the door, his notebook ready, and made no effort to disguise his reluctance at having been persuaded, against every instinct of his profession, to release Julian Crewe from custody that very morning upon Holmes's assurance alone. Crewe himself had not been asked to attend, but sent word, Harcourt informed us, that he would await the outcome at his lodgings with what patience he could muster. Holmes began without preamble, standing before the mahogany cabinet that had occupied so much of our attention these past days. "I wish first to clear a name that has been very cruelly used in this business," said he. "Julian Crewe took no part whatever in the removal of the Bellamy patent, and I shall demonstrate, before I have finished, precisely how the appearance of his guilt was constructed, brick by careful brick, by a hand a great deal more patient than his own." Lestrade shifted, but said nothing, and Holmes continued. "The footprints beneath the study window were never made by a man climbing in or out. They were pressed into the flower bed in Spectre, using one of Crewe's own spare boots, a pair he kept, as surveyors commonly do, in the survey room downstairs, accessible to anyone in this household with sufficient reason to borrow them for an hour, and sufficient care to return them unmarked. The knot upon the curtain cord was tied by someone who had studied Crewe's habitual manner of tying such knots closely enough to attempt an imitation, yet had never learned the motion in his own hand, and so reversed it without realizing his error. And the cabinet lock gentleman was never picked at all. Nor was Mr. Bellamy's key ever copied, borrowed, or tampered with in any fashion. Then how? Bellamy began. Because the patent was never in that cabinet on the night it was supposed to have been stolen from it. It had already been removed, Mr. Bellamy, before you ever placed the portfolio inside and turned your key upon it. The theft, properly speaking, occurred earlier, upon the very afternoon the document lay openly upon this desk, while it passed from hand to hand among the several people gathered in this room, and while at least one pair of eyes among you watched for the moment when no one else was watching at all. He turned then, and I saw every eye in the room follow the direction of his gaze, coming to rest at last upon Philip Marsh. The clerk did not flinch, nor did his mild expression alter by so much as a shadow, and for a moment I wondered whether Holmes had, after all, mistaken his man. But Holmes continued without hesitation. Mr. Marsh prepared the leather portfolio in which the patent was to be kept, a fact to which Mr. Harcourt himself can testify, having watched him smooth its interior with his own particular care that same afternoon. During some brief interval, while Miss Bellamy stepped from the room, or while Mr. Harcourt's attention was engaged elsewhere, Mr. Marsh substituted for the true patent a carefully manufactured facsimile, a document prepared, I have no doubt, over a period of many weeks, upon paper genuinely old, though not the paper it pretended to be, and sealed with wax whose colour would ultimately betray its author, however cleverly its cracks were avoided. That substitute was somewhat thicker than the true patent, gentlemen, and left its impression upon the portfolio's retaining straps precisely as I found it, a detail so small that its maker never troubled to guard against it. "You mean the cabinet held nothing but a forgery from that afternoon forward," said Harcourt, in a voice grown suddenly hoarse. From that afternoon forward, yes. Mr. Marsh had only to wait, then, for a convenient moment to remove even the forgery, and to construct around its absence the appearance of a midnight theft violent and mysterious enough to satisfy Inspector Lestrade's very reasonable instincts. The staged footprints, the scratched latch, the false knot. He planted the same forgery, some while later, in a locker rented under a name that cannot presently be traced to him with certainty, though I do not doubt it soon will be, and directed the police to its discovery by an anonymous note designed to end the inquiry precisely where he wished it ended, upon Julian Crewe's shoulders and nowhere near his own. Marsh spoke at last, and his voice, though quiet, had lost something of its former mildness. "This is a remarkable tale, Mr. Holmes, built upon a seal and a fold and a stretched strap of leather. I wonder that a jury would credit it." "A jury need not credit deduction alone, Mr. Marsh, when it may instead be shown the truth itself." Holmes's tone hardened by the smallest degree. "For I have found the genuine patent, hidden precisely where a methodical man, accustomed for 20 years to the ordering of old papers, would think to conceal it, within an obsolete deed box in Mr. Harcourt's own archive, among records so seldom consulted that its absence from its true place might have gone unremarked for years. The green wax flake I discovered beneath this very cabinet came, I have no doubt, from the same materials you employed in preparing your forgery's false seal, carried there upon your own sleeve or fingers without your notice." A silence fell upon the room that I shall not soon forget, the particular silence of a company watching a mask fall slowly away from a face that has worn it so long the face beneath seems almost a stranger's. "You did not intend to destroy the true patent, Mr. Marsh," Holmes continued more quietly now. "You intended to use it. It contains, does it not, a handwritten clause describing the original boundary of this land, as it stood before an amendment executed under Josiah Fenwick's hand, transferred a portion of your father's freehold into Sir Matthew Bellamy's possession. You have waited 20 years, watching that worthless acreage grow steadily more valuable, for the day when such proof might finally matter to someone with the means to act upon it. That day arrived with the railway company's offer, and you delayed no longer. Marsh, or Marston, as I understood now I must properly call him, said nothing for a long moment, and when at last he spoke, it was without any further pretence at the mildness he had worn so convincingly for 20 years. "My father died believing himself robbed, Mr. Holmes, and no court in England would hear him. I have done nothing but return to my family what patience and the law denied us." "You have done a great deal more than that," Holmes replied, "as I think you know very well. But that is a matter, Inspector, for you and for the courts to weigh, and not for me to judge alone in this room." Lestrade, recovering himself at last, stepped forward and placed a hand upon Marsh's shoulder, and the quiet clerk who had ordered the Bellamy papers for 20 years offered no resistance whatever as he was led from the house. Chapter 10. The Boundary Between Truth and Proof. Several weeks had passed before I found occasion to return to Baker Street on an errand of no greater urgency than idle friendship, and I confess I was glad of the excuse, for the fog that had hung so persistently over London throughout the affair of the Bellamy patent had lifted at last, giving way to a clear, pale winter sunlight that fell in long bars across Holmes's chemical table, and picked out, with unkind clarity, the accumulated dust of his more recent experiments. I found him in good spirits, a state I had learned not to take for granted in the weeks following the conclusion of a case, and he greeted my arrival by clearing a space among his retorts and inviting me to share the last of a pot of tea gone lukewarm upon the hearth. "You will be glad to hear," said he, before I had properly seated myself, "that Julian Crewe has been entirely cleared of every charge laid against him, and has moreover been engaged by the railway company itself to complete the very survey that first brought him under suspicion. I understand he bears no great resentment toward Lestrade for his trouble, which speaks rather better of his character than the inspector's original theory of it." "And the Bellamy family?" I asked. "I confess I have wondered a good deal how matters stood between them and the unfortunate Mr. Marston, once the truth of his history came to light. There, Watson, the resolution has proved a good deal more creditable to all concerned than I had dared to hope. Charles and Eleanor Bellamy have agreed, upon Harcourt's advice, and I think their own better instincts besides, not to contest an independent examination of the original boundary dispute, the very transaction that cost Marston's father his freehold 30 years ago. The evidence, once properly weighed by counsel, with no interest in concealing it, appears to show quite clearly that a portion of the railway company's compensation rightfully belongs to Marston's descendants rather than to the Bellamy estate, whatever a document's forged seals may once have obscured." "A remarkable turn," I said, "though I own I did not expect the family to concede so readily, having so lately recovered their fortune from the very man who stole it." "They have not conceded without persuasion," Holmes admitted with the faint dryness that crept into his voice whenever he touched upon the ordinary frailties of human motive. "Harcourt has argued their case with a good deal more conscience than the law strictly required of him, urging that Marston's long history of service and the genuine injustice his father suffered be weighed by the court alongside whatever crimes the son committed in pursuit of a very old grievance. I believe he feels, not without reason, that his own office bears some share of responsibility for having employed the man 20 years without once troubling to inquire too closely into his origins. And Marston himself, what becomes of him?" Holmes's expression grew somewhat graver. "He faces prosecution, Watson, for theft, for forgery, and for the deliberate attempt to see an innocent man convicted in his place. The last of which, I confess, troubles me a good deal more than the first two, whatever sympathy one might otherwise extend to a man robbed by the law's own indifference. A stolen inheritance may in time be restored. A man's liberty, lost upon false evidence deliberately manufactured, is not so easily returned to him. I have little patience for thieves who dress their crimes in the borrowed clothes of justice, and less still for those willing to let another man hang, or very nearly, for a theft they alone committed." I considered this for a moment, turning my cup between my hands, and then asked the question that had occupied me, in one form or another, since the very first evening Harcourt had climbed our stair. "What first convinced you that Crewe was innocent, Holmes? You seemed to doubt him from very nearly the beginning, when the whole of the evidence pointed so decidedly the other way." "Several things taken together, though none alone would have satisfied me," said he, settling back in his chair. "The footprints pointing the wrong direction were suspicious from the first moment I examined them. The reverse knot was, I think, the most instructive single clue in the whole affair, for it told me not merely that the evidence had been staged, but something of the character of the man who staged it. Patient, observant, yet betrayed at last by the one thing observation alone cannot teach, which is the unthinking habit of a hand that has performed a motion 10,000 times without once considering how it does so. But none of these settled the matter conclusively. None of them. The decisive proof, Watson, lay in the recovered patent itself. In the very moment everyone in that room, myself very nearly included, felt the case had been solved. There is a particular danger in an expected discovery, one I have observed 100 times in the course of my work and never yet grown weary of guarding against. When a man finds precisely what he has been prepared, however subtly to seek, he seldom troubles himself to ask whether he has found the right thing at all. Lestrade wished to find the stolen patent in Crewe's possession, and so a forged patent, planted with exactly that expectation in mind, satisfied him as completely as the genuine article might have done. it was only by refusing to feel that satisfaction myself, by asking what a green seal upon an old crease could possibly mean, when every reasonable soul in the room was ready to close the case and go home to dinner, that the truth ever came to light at all. I reflected, as Holmes fell silent and reached at last for his violin, that the mystery of the Bellamy patent had depended, when one considered it whole, upon 3 substitutions, each concealing the other like a set of nested boxes, a forged document standing in for a genuine one, an innocent surveyor standing accused in place of a guilty clerk, and an old and genuine grievance dressed up, however understandably, in the borrowed garments of present justice. It struck me too that Holmes himself had been the only person in that crowded study who had declined, at every stage, to accept the substitution offered him, however convincingly each was dressed. Outside, the ordinary traffic of Baker Street had resumed beneath the clear winter sky, and the last of the fog that had lain so heavily over the whole of this strange affair had gone from the streets entirely, leaving only the customary rattle of cabs and the cries of newsboys to mark the city's return to its accustomed business. Holmes drew his bow across the strings, coaxing from the instrument some low and thoughtful air I did not recognise, and I sat a while longer in the fading afternoon light, turning over in my mind the lesson his final words had left with me, that the reasoning which had saved an innocent man and brought a very old wrong at last into the light had depended upon nothing more mysterious than a refusal to stop looking once everyone else in the room believed the answer had already been found.